Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. I'm excited for today's interview, but before we get there, I want to say thank you to our patron supporters. Because of your support, I get to produce free material like this and put it out there on the internet. And so um, I'm kind of having trouble hearing myself, so if there's anybody in the live chat that can let me know if everything's working properly or not, I'd appreciate that. Otherwise, I may have to do some technical difficulty stuff anyway. Just wanted to put that out there real quick. But today I am going to be interviewing with, let me bring her in here, Laura Robinson. Welcome back to the show, Laura. I really appreciate you coming
Hi,
on.
Hayden.
Yeah.
Third show.
Yeah, third show. The last two were very popular, so I'm expecting this one to go
Sure.
along the similar
Gonna
lines.
make
It looks like the audio and everything's doing good, so I'll quit worrying about that. That was kind of been in the
good.
back of my mind this whole time. But yeah, I'm excited to
Well,
have.
wouldn't be a Laura Robinson show without technical difficulties, as
Mm-hmm.
we've learned from Testament review. So,
Yeah, exactly. It wouldn't be the same without that. But it looks like things are going well. So, yeah, I'm very excited
perfect.
to have you on. I do want to mention one more thing before we get started. If you have a question for Laura, you can submit it in the live chat. And be sure to tag at Help Me Believe at the beginning of your comment. And that kind of helps me see it. And of course, if you want to send in a super chat, I will address those first. But Laura, I've had you on before, and we've kind of discussed this topic kind of ancillary or whatever the word is there. But
One could say we've talked about it a lot,
yeah,
Hayden.
yeah, one could say that we have discussed the resurrection, but just
But
really quick.
there is still confusion.
Yeah, there is still
So,
confusion. So that's part of what we want to do today. Is Laura's been on the show before, and after her first time on, then she started getting invited to go on other channels, and she's become a YouTube sensation. She's quite popular these days, and for good reason. And But anyways, so she ends up on Capturing Christianity, doing a discussion with Mike Licona, and then there was some written and YouTube video responses to that discussion that we felt quite misrepresented Laura in her position, and so we wanted to kind of do this to set the record straight. But also, it should just be a fun interview in and of its own right. But real quickly, Laura, what or take as much time as you want, I guess. What were your thoughts about that discussion that you had with Mike Licona?
I mean, my short answer is I thought I did well, but
You did do well. You did do very well. I was actually let's see. I was actually very impressed. I mean, I knew you would do well. I know that you know your stuff. Um, but just because Lycona, like this is his gig. Talking about the historicity of the resurrection, I'm guessing isn't really your thing. You went on.
it is absolutely not. No,
Yeah,
this is not something I specialize in. This is something that's kind of become Ian and I's bailiwick since we did that Case for Christ show. But no, I mean, I had never. It was the first time I met Mike. He's a nice person. He's easy to talk to. It wasn't something I particularly wanted to do, to be totally honest. I honestly kind of have a hard time saying no to something once I've indicated some kind of interest in something,
yeah.
so I tend to, which is basically how I ended up on your show in the first place.
Yep.
And,
That's true. That's true. No
so,
offense taken.
it wasn't something I particularly wanted to do, but I saw an opening for me to talk about something that I think does matter, which is, the question of why should people be Christians, and what does it even mean to be a Christian? Like, is a Christian someone who is convinced of a certain propositional idea, or is Christianity a lot more than that? And I saw an opening to talk about this because I think that a lot of times the way that apologetics functions, through no fault of the character of the apologist, is that it very much affirms and pushes this narrative that being a Christian is basically initialing next to a series of propositional statements, which is a very Western Protestant way of thinking about this. That if you think XYZ, then you are a Christian. And I don't think it's a great way to think about religion, particularly Christianity, but just religion in general. And I also think it misrepresents the significance of what the resurrection was for the earliest Christians. I don't think the earliest Christians thought of this as a thumbs up, thumbs down proposition. I think they were thinking about this in terms of something that had a lot more of an obvious impact on their life on a day-to-day basis because of the insistence that you could relate to Jesus, that he was still alive. And so one of the things that when I think about the interview and the way it goes, the part that gets quoted to me constantly from this is the whole I'm coming at this from a historian versus Laura coming at this as a theologian idea. And which is kind of funny because I've actually resisted the idea that my training's in theology repeatedly in public. It's not. My training is mostly in history. But I also think that it's not accurate to play those off against each other. So the idea that the resurrection was a thing that we can demonstrate happened in history with the tools of post-Enlightenment historical criticism, that's versus the resurrection is a thing that is apprehended by faith, that is apprehended in communities, and this was what early Christians were thinking about when they talked about it. That's neither the first one is not history, and the second one is not theology. This is theology informing history. How did the earliest Christians think about their theological doctrines? Like, this is neither that you can't make a distinction between whether or not
it's possibly historical theology.
Exactly. Right. That's another great way to think about it. Is how did the church fathers think about that? So I think that's I should have written some notes down for how I wanted to go through this. Sorry.
No, you're good.
I think of it, and then I think the other thing that makes these things kind of difficult is that it's very hard to talk about Christianity when there is not some kind of a shared context between two people to make sense of it, even if that context is just friendship and mutual trust. Because the reality is, the vast majority of people on the internet, in the audiences, in the comic section, are not your friends. And, a lot of people can't understand you, don't want to understand you, are very invested in having a specific kind of understanding of you. So I think one big reason why I like doing this kind of a show here with you is that there's a shared context here. So there's no necessity of somebody, and I would hope at least somebody watching this who's seen Haden and has seen me on the other shows. No one's sitting here watching this trying to figure out if I'm really a Christian, right? Or nobody's sitting here trying to come back and like recreate possible reasons for why I might think what I'm thinking about. And what often inevitably happens in those situations is that people are putting their own worldview onto what you're doing. So one of the cases we'll talk about today, which particularly irritated me, was this. There's this one blog, Christian Defenders. Don't look it up. Don't give them page hits. They're idiots. Had this very strong had this claim at the beginning of their article that I didn't take a strong stand on the resurrection because I didn't want to offend people, like a liberal. And it's just no, like you can't just put your own, the way you've divided up the world into PC cucks and everybody else, and just put that onto people. So I think one thing that's really important about having, when you're producing content and collaborating, if there's not some kind of shared understanding here that like we both know we're Christians, the audience knows we're both Christians, we have a pre-existing relationship. If you don't have that, you kind of have to belabor points over and over again that people should be really able to pick up on the first go, but they don't. So that's, anyways.
Well, if they don't pick up on it, I mean, let's be honest, it's because they don't want to, and people are trying to score points, and they're not listening for comprehension. So I'm gonna write a written response to the article that you referenced. I was just gonna wait until we did this, even though I already have it written, waiting to publish it. But one of the points that I'm gonna make at the end, because I'm gonna give some advice, is read and listen for comprehension, not for don't just immediately start with, okay, I know I'm going to disagree with this, so let me read with the intention of finding where I'm going to disagree, or finding where the ill motive is coming in, and try to And that's an okay. Anyway, we could go on about that, but I better move on
No,
to
it
some.
was great. Yeah,
Well. One of the things is like pontificating about your interlocutor or your opponent if you are finding yourself in a formal debate or if you're doing a response, pontificating about the other person's motivations and desires is
yeah,
wasted breath. Because if what you're looking for is, okay, what's true and what's not, in this case, the question would be, is the resurrection something that we can get at historically or not? That would seem to be the subject matter. And then you're
right,
pontificating about somebody's motivations
right.
and their
Yeah,
desires has nothing to do with that. It's completely
no, no,
irrational. So even on your
right.
own, these in the apologetic circles, everybody wants to be rational and things like that. But that's completely irrational. It's completely irrational to pontificate, to continue that word, about someone's motivations and desires. It's utterly useless. You're wasting your breath and wasting our time by doing it. And
Yeah.
it's just, it looks really bad.
Yeah. The other thing is that, a lot of times, and again, I think this is where shared content and listening for comprehension dovetail in really important ways. A lot of times, like, it's important to remember that, the person who you're listening to is talking about the issue they're talking about. They're not talking about all the other issues. And if you don't understand what specific thing you're talking about, you're not going to get it. So the thing I love, in watching people respond to this is, people asking things like, "Oh, why doesn't she believe in a physical resurrection?"
Right. And I went and took me
Say anything.
5 seconds. It took me 5 seconds to find Laura, quote, say that she does believe the resurrection was, here's the quote, I have it memorized now, physical in some sense. And so, anyway,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but it drives me nuts.
No, 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 no. I think that's good. But again, there's not. I think this is what comes from having a lot of people who are more interested in figuring out ways to reply and defend a certain
Yeah.
position than they are in understanding it, because it's not, these issues aren't don't all just come in a braid together. So talking about the physicality of the resurrection versus the non-physicality is not the same thing about talking about the reliability of the empty tomb narrative versus the unreliability of it versus the historical provability, or if you want to fudge on provability because that's everyone's favorite thing, the historical demonstrative, the ability to demonstrate the historicity of the resurrection. Those are all separate issues and they have to be discussed separately, and different data is relevant for each of those questions. So
Yeah.
that's just my advice to people.
And then
Yeah.
there's one last thing on this point for me, anyway, just so I can get everything off my chest. Is even if you are convinced, like I have the truth, and so and perhaps you feel that way for good reason. It is possible to just be so convinced of something based on good evidence, good reason, things like that, that you already know that you have the truth. I'm trying to think of an example of a belief that I don't really hold tentatively. Okay, so I hold the belief that God exists very strongly. I'm
Yeah.
sure somebody's going to bring an objection to that belief. I'm already pretty positive that they've made an error. That's just how I feel. Now but I'm
Yeah.
still going, and this is where I'm getting at, is I'm still going to listen for comprehension when they come to me, because you cannot respond or defend against that objection unless you first really understand it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you're going to be defending against or responding to a caricature. And I guess this comes down to persuasion. If you really want to persuade somebody of your, because at the end of this article, Laura, that you referenced, I don't know if you read the whole thing or not, but at the end of it,
I haven't yet, but yeah.
the author, who's unnamed, expresses their desire
Oh,
that you will honestly listen to the evidence that they have to offer. And all I could think was, why on earth would she want to listen to you? Because I mean, you
yeah.
just blatantly lied, you misrepresented her entire position, and
Oh, yeah.
questioned her authenticity as a Christian. Why on earth would
Why
she?
would I care what you think?
Yeah.
Why would I care what you think?
Whereas,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
Whereas,
I can't understand about. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a counterexample. So the way that you and I dialogue, we clearly disagree on plenty of things. But if you have an objection to some of my currently held beliefs, it's gonna matter to me. I'm more likely to listen to you because we're friends. The mutual trust thing that you were mentioning earlier. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's pretty infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you were I think I keep thinking about like the creation of some kind of like public discourse 101
Hmm.
course, for podcasters, or because I think that all of this stuff is so important that if you have not understood someone's position, it nothing else that comes next matters. Nothing that comes next matters. If you cannot, this is a Mark Goodacre quote that I absolutely love, that when you are establishing somebody's position before you respond to it, you are not done until your opponent can look at that, at what you have described as their position, and say, yes, that is exactly what I believe.
Right.
And if you can't do that,
You're
nothing else
excused.
you've done matters. Yeah, there are such, and there are such stupid humans out there who just don't grasp that don't grasp that you have to be able to, if you can't do that, nothing else matters. And the fact that you found a little audience of choir preachers who don't notice doesn't mean you're doing good argumentation. So
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it is. It's one of the most frustrating things in the world. It's almost half the reason why I started this channel in the first place,
yeah,
was
yeah,
to have people on and just listen to them and try. And I don't always exemplify this myself, but try to be a good example of someone who can listen and learn and things like that. But anyway, so let's get to some of the questions. I'm not.
yeah.
I'm not actually posing the questions in the.
I just put a few comments in the chat that we were gonna start up again in a second.
All right,
So
we have started.
yeah. Oh, yay,
Yay! We
good.
got that last bit of Laura.
Yay.
Yay! Okay, we're back.
Yeah.
Sorry, people. It wouldn't be a
Sorry,
show
guys.
with Laura Robinson if there weren't technical difficulties.
Something
Uh,
didn't go terribly wrong.
Hurricane Laura came through here, messed up my Wi-Fi connection or something. So
Yeah.
we are back. Let me know if there's any audio or video problems in the live chat, anything like that. I forgot to
Yeah.
check and make sure that the microphone is still. Yeah, it looks like it's still good.
I can
Okay.
hear it still.
Okay, anyway, so let's get to some of these questions. The first one is, okay, do you believe that the resurrection was a historical event?
One more time. Yes. Yes.
So what is it that,
Resurrect.
yeah.
Sorry.
I was going to say, so what is it then that you mean? Because I think the confusion, and there shouldn't be any confusion, but the confusion is that people are hearing you say that you don't think the
Yeah.
tools of history can get us to that conclusion,
Yeah.
but that you still
Yeah.
believe in the conclusion. So perhaps drawing that out.
Yeah. So here's what I would say about the resurrection. I think the resurrection was a thing that happened to Jesus's body. So I don't mean that it was a metaphorical event that the apostles experienced. I feel like there's a way of describing this that sounds like you're trying to get it like a less real resurrection. I don't think it was a metaphor. I don't think it was a way of describing confidence in God. I don't think this was a thing that happened primarily internally in people's hearts. I think the resurrection of Jesus happened to Jesus's body physically. I don't know that I can describe the mechanism by which that happened. I think some people want to say more about this than the New Testament tells us. Whatever it was, it happened to Jesus' body. It changed it. It's like Jesus' resurrection form is not completely analogous to the body that was left in the tomb. It has been transformed. It has different stuff. And this is an event that is purely supernatural. It is an event for which the moment of resurrection is not well attested in ancient literature because it was not a moment that was of primary interest to the authors. The moments that they were interested in was the experience of Jesus appearing to them. So when I say that it is supernatural and the moment of the resurrection is not widely attested in the sources, what I mean is we cannot demonstrate, using the tools of history, using the normal documents and the sources that we have, we cannot recover the moment of the resurrection the way we would recover something like the moment of the siege of Jerusalem. Like, we just don't have that level of documentation. And I also think this is by design, because I don't think the primary interest of the gospel writers or the New Testament writers is this murder mystery style way of thinking about the resurrection of Jesus, where we've got our sources and our evidence and we've got our witnesses. We're going to go and we're going to find out what really happened for ourselves. I think this is a way of doing history, specifically about Jesus, that treats Jesus as a lot deader than he really is. That we have to go back and find this event that has been lost, and if we can determine it with some reasonable likelihood, then we can check this off. We can initial next to this idea on our statement of faith, and then we are Christians. Mm-hmm. And that's not how the early church thought about the resurrection. The resurrection, the payoff of it was that Jesus was alive and that he was involved in the community, and that this is the moment that people were the most interested in the early church. Is Jesus appearing to people, or Jesus being present in the community and bringing about transformation, like the transformation that is affected by his resurrection? That's the thing that's of significance to people, not the murder. So yeah.
So this wasn't in the original questions that I sent you, but since you said you didn't prepare for them anyway, I figured it'd be okay to ask.
I wrote, yeah, I read them. I promise.
So it seems like you're drawing a distinction between, say, like you said, the actual moment of Jesus being dead and then coming back to life. That event is not something. That event's not attested at all, I guess.
No, no one heard about it.
Yeah, but what you're saying seems to be of more significance for both the gospel authors and Paul and just everybody in the New Testament is the appearances of Jesus after his death. And so perhaps would you be willing to say that we have really good attestation for Jesus' death? And how do you feel about the attestation to the appearances?
The evidence for Jesus' death, I think, is probably about as sure as anything you're going to get in historical Jesus research. I think if there's one thing we know that happened to Jesus, for sure, it's the crucifixion. Okay. Because of multiple attestation. I think that's a very good thing to... I think that there's great evidence for that. I do think, I'm just going to take a little pushback on Lycona here, which I did in the interview. I don't think I don't know, Lycona really likes to spin the fact of the crucifixion as a piece of evidence for the resurrection, that everyone agrees the crucifixion happened and this is part of our minimal facts about the resurrection. No, Jesus is dead. The crucifixion, it's interesting that we have data for this, but there's nothing about the crucifixion one way or another that points to a resurrection. It's just this is what happened. Jesus died. Where was I going with this? And then another thing we have excellent attestation of, again, as excellent as you're going to get when you're talking about something written about by peasants in the first century, is people continuously thinking that they saw Jesus or had some kind of experience of him in their communities. And this goes quite a bit beyond, again, the sort of forensic style of evidence of people seeing Jesus who, knew him in life. Well, no, the Corinthians were interacting with Jesus. This is all the Corinthian correspondence. The Galatians were interacting with Jesus. The experience of Jesus being involved in your communities was a huge part of how the early church operated. And again, this is not quite the same thing is saying they saw Jesus buried and then they saw him alive again, and therefore the only possible conclusion was that his flesh had been resurrected. It's that there was this continuous experience in the church of people interacting with the resurrected Christ, Spirit of Christ, whatever you want to describe that. But again, I think that is it's historical evidence for the way Christians thought about their faith. That's not the same thing as saying that it's historical evidence for the resurrection, because there's actually lots of reasons why people might have a vision of somebody, or there's lots of reasons why people might have a supernatural experience.
Yeah. So one of my follow-up questions was going to be along these lines. So let me ask it, which was, okay, so you think there's good evidence to support the conclusion that Jesus was crucified, and there's good evidence to support the conclusion that people had experiences of Jesus after his death.
Yeah.
and then but then you would want to demarcate that, or say something like, but that doesn't
Yeah.
we can't say, okay, Jesus was crucified and people after his death had experiences of him, therefore resurrection.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that what we do have is evidence that people in churches were and people were forming communities around a shared experience of the resurrected Christ. That is neutral. That is a neutral piece of data that, we can't say anything about whether or not they were correct or incorrect in that assumption. We can just observe as historians that people continuously felt this way.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And then as a
yeah.
Christian, you would want to say that you've had you and other Christians today have this same experience. Um,
Yeah, or have participated in communities of people that are informed by the reality of Christ, that are informed by the living Jesus. I think sometimes the way this can get understood is by is that I am reducing the experience of being a Christian to emotional spiritual experiences, and that's not really quite what I'm trying to get at.
good.
I think there's more than one way to interact with. I think there's more than one way to be a participant in the community of the resurrected Jesus. Some people do have profound religious experiences. Some people have private religious experiences. Some people have community experiences. Some people participate in a community that is informed by Jesus in other ways. I think that when we think about the ways communities in churches reflect the experience of Christ, a lot of this comes down to there's more than one way to interact with the presence of God. I think service is part of it. I think community singing can be part of it. Preaching can be part of it. So I think whenever you have people participating in the work of Christ, in like work that is infused and innervated by the Holy Spirit, that is participation in Christ. That is participation in Jesus' community. So I don't think it's quite the same thing as hanging everything on mystical experiences. I think there's a lot more to the experiential side of being a Christian, in the participation side of being a Christian. So.
So what? One thing that people are going to ask and have asked is, what about people who don't have this kind of
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah. Sure.
Is there any other way for them
Yeah.
to become or to is there any other way for them to know the truths of Christianity?
Yeah. I think my response to that, there's two immediate tacks I would take on that, based on whether you are somebody who wants to have religious experiences or someone who does not want to. Some people are perfectly content their entire lives to not have religious experiences. And a lot of times this can include being part of a religious community. Like, you are content to go to church, you are content to be involved in the community, to participate in care, outreach, if your church does some sort of like community outreach, community service. I think that if you are content to receive the traditions of Christianity and participate as a Christian without any kind of an experiential element, I think God is perfectly capable of meeting you where you are. I think about my parents. My parents are pretty relaxed, Indiana folk. I don't think they have a terrible amount of interest in like charismatic activity. But I think God is perfectly capable of meeting you there. Now, the other side of this is people who want to have religious experiences but don't. And I think there's a few different ways I would respond to this. One is that we don't always know why some people have these experiences and some people don't, right? Like, I'm not going to attach terms and conditions to these, like, well, if you were doing X, then you would, or if you weren't doing Y, then you would. No, we don't really know why. So I don't want to attribute it to faith, lack of faith, doubt, whatever like that. We don't always know why. But I would say, I think there's just some general advice I would give people who are interested in having religious experiences. One is to keep praying for it. keep seeking it. I think this happens to a lot of people. A lot of people have a spiritual life that involves seeking out some kind of like greater interpersonal connection with God, and then the longer when then by seeking it they do eventually find it. And the other thing I would say is go where Jesus is. So where do we find Jesus hanging out in the New Testament? Well, with the lost and the least and the poor and the oppressed and people who need his care. So, if you aren't doing something service oriented, or if you're not interested in loving those kinds of people and providing genuine care for them, I'm not terribly surprised you haven't found Jesus. But I think if so those are the two kinds of ways I'd break this down. Are you interested in having the experience? Are you not interested in having them? Or the third door is, are you interested in winning an argument? Maybe Christianity's not about winning arguments. That's maybe you don't get to win this argument, and you know what? You're gonna be okay.
Yeah.
So
I'm thinking of the person in my mind. I'm thinking of the person who is a non-believer and is thinking, I quite agree with Laura that this is not, I cannot reach the conclusion Jesus rose from the dead through a historical argument. I would be quite content if something happened to me now in the present, excuse me, and of which I, some kind of experience that affirmed for me that in fact he had risen from the dead, because either there he is, or here is some effect that could only be caused by him, and therefore I believe. And so I'm thinking of somebody like that who has not had that experience. And I don't know if really the history of it has nothing to offer in favor of lending the conclusion, and they haven't had some kind of experience like that. I don't know what else.
I think,
I don't know.
I think the first thing I would push back on is I don't think the idea that the resurrection as a moment in history cannot be reproduced or proved or demonstrated with the tools of history. I don't think this is the same thing as saying that history doesn't do work for Christians.
Okay.
Because history is obviously a huge part of what we're doing as Christians. Like we are we are people who have inherited a story and traditions, and we're passing them down. So, one thing I would say is, maybe you can't use the tools of history to demonstrate that the resurrection happened, but you absolutely can use the tools of history to figure out how Paul thought about the resurrection and what difference that made for his life. So I would say, start there. If you want to understand the resurrection, maybe don't worry about as much about the thumbs up, thumbs down on the evidence, and start thinking about how these people in the first century, the first people who became convinced of this, how they thought about it. So, maybe study the role of the resurrection in the book of Matthew, or or study the role of the resurrection in the book of Luke, or the obvious one here is Paul, is what is the resurrection? Why does it matter? And how does it work for him? And you might come to some level of connection with this story, or some level of identification with it through that process that I think is a lot more powerful than did the resurrection happen or did it not happen? Because, of course, in that case, we still haven't even gotten to the question of why does it matter? Why do I care? But when you look at Paul's story, the why does it matter? Why do I care? Was woven into his whole story and his whole theology of why this matters. So I would definitely turn you to history if you want to learn more about Christianity. It just depends what you're trying to do with it. So that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna ask one more question, then I'm going to start looking through the comments. So if you have a comment, be sure to submit it in the or a question, excuse me. If you have a question, be sure to submit it in the live chat. Be sure to tag at Help Me Believe at the beginning of before your question, and that'll help me find it. If you want to give a super chat, of course, I'll address those first. We're going to start going through those pretty soon, so be sure to submit your questions if you have any. Any and all questions for Laura are welcomed, so be sure to put those in there. Laura, one more question from me is, Do you think the resurrection was a physical or spiritual event? And yeah, just what are your thoughts on that dichotomy?
So I'm very glad I'm very glad I actually read this question before I answered it, because I think I got very close to saying something stupid.
Hmm.
But I thought about it and I was like, wait, hang on, I got this one. Okay, it's both. Of course, it's both. A physical only resurrection doesn't matter at all. It just means you were dead and then you weren't dead. No spiritual implications for this, or why people should still be talking about it 2,000 years later. I think that, when we look at Paul and we look at what Paul said about the resurrection and why it mattered, it did involve Jesus's body in some capacity. He doesn't know the this whole story, but he does know that it involved Jesus's flesh in this level of elevation and transformation, that Jesus's flesh became something very different, and that the flesh of our bodies, which is enslaved to sin and subject to mortality, that the good news of the resurrection is that one day it's going to go away. So that is physical, but of course it's spiritual. Of course it's spiritual to mean that you are resurrected in a way that you are freed from the enslaving power of sin and death. Of course that's spiritual. So these things work together. And again, I think this is part of the issue with this like forensic style reading of the resurrection, where we treat Jesus's body, dead or not, as this, historical problem we need to solve. We miss all of this theological significance to it and why it matters right now for us as people. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to talk about the spiritual side. If we just talk about the physical side, we miss all of that. So
yeah. That was a very theological of you, Laura, but I was really looking for some kind of historical.
Was it not historical? That would happen.
Okay, look, we got a question from Metal Theologian. It says, "What do you think of Peter Rollins?" I don't know who that is. Perhaps you do, Laura.
I don't know who that is. Can I Google it?
You're welcome to. But if you don't know who it is, I'm probably just gonna move on to another question.
Yeah. Okay. Give me another question.
Okay, this one is from Nick Quint. Says, question, what does Laura, hi friend, think about the women proclaiming the good news of the resurrection? How does our historical method impact women's gifts and calling in the church?
Yeah. Again, the story of the empty tomb, it's very frustrating that story is not in Paul, and that Paul doesn't seem to know it in his litany of the people who had visions of Jesus. But I do think that it's very important that Mark gives us this counter narrative to what happened in Paul, because in Paul, we have a series of witnesses of the resurrection, and they're all dudes and they're all church leaders. And I think Mark provides a really fascinating counterpoint. What?
I just, for the dudes. I don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
Church leaders. Okay, I thought you were doing this, and I was like, okay, no. But I think that the fact that Mark foregrounds people who aren't famous, people who don't become authority figures in the church, I think this is very representative of Mark's larger theology. Mark likes things that are ironic and are surprising and are not the way we would expect things to go about the Messiah. So I think the fact that Mark gives the first sight of the resurrection to three women who were following Jesus the whole time, there's two levels of what Mark tells us there that's very important. One is that Mark kind of reveals accidentally at the very end of the gospel that there's been this group of women traveling around with Jesus the entire time, and they've always been part of this. We've been hearing about the disciples, but since they all ran away scared, now we've just got the women, and because they stuck around, they're the ones who see the resurrection. So there's something very ironic here. But I think that this is useful, it's hard when you're talking about something for which you only have one theological source to talk about its historicity, like up or down. But I think we see a lot of what Mark is doing with that story in the way it works in his narrative, that Mark likes ascribing power and significance and triumph to weak and despised things and people. So I think if we're talking about, women preaching, I think the idea that women are not supposed to be involved in preaching based on some kind of idea of the weakness of women, which I think is yeah, it's gone the way of the dodo, but sort of a classic explanation for why women can't preach. According to Mark, that's exactly why they should. So, I think that's a little interesting irony.
Yeah.
Thanks. Great question, Nick.
Yeah. This question comes from the BDS, it's just some initials. It says, are Christians committed to certainty, or is the emphasis on having faith admitting that we don't have certainty?
Yeah, I feel like certainty is a word with a lot of fudging involved, because I think it's very common for people to it's very common for people involved in apologetics, in my experience, to say that of course we can't prove things, of course we can't have certainty. But then the vigilance and the zealotry with which you pursue the apologetic progress sure seems like you're pursuing something that's a lot more valuable and that it's a lot more useful for hanging your faith on than just probable cause, right? So I think this is also why I'm so skeptical of the apologetic process, is that it really that in that project, because I think it promises a lot more, intentionally or not, implicitly or not, about what it can do for your faith, to preserve your faith, than it actually can. So I don't think. The other thing I want to push back on is the idea that certainty and faith are things that are on some kind of a competition with each other, because faith is not something you believe but you're not sure of, and whereas certainty is the opposite. Faith is completely different from certainty or uncertainty. Faith is relational. Faith is trust. Faith is, Matthew Bates's word is allegiance. Faith is obedience. There's so much more involved in faith and what it is, that I don't think it's really useful to put it in conversation with certainty, because like when I say that I have faith in God, it doesn't mean that I have no evidence there's a God there, but I'm just choosing to believe it because I got to have faith in something. It means that I have put my trust in God. It means I'm obeying God. It means I'm going where God wants me to go. That's what's included in faith.
Yeah.
So
I like the term allegiance a lot.
Yeah. Matthew Bates has popularized that for sure. Yeah.
So this question comes from Aaron Chitzmar, if I pronounce that correctly. It says, what distinguishes Christianity from other religions? Why be a Christian rather than a Muslim, a Jew, a Buddhist, etc.?
I mean, I can't tell you about as opposed to being a Muslim or a Jew, because I'm not any of those things. I have good Muslim and Jewish friends, and I have a lot of admiration for a lot of aspects of their faith. But all I can tell you is what I think is unique about Christianity and why I think it's so special. I think the idea of a God becoming a person is tremendously powerful to me, and it's tremendously beautiful. I think there is something suggested there in God's solidarity with humanity and how much humanity matters to God, that God would be willing to do that for us. So I think when I think about Jesus and about God becoming a person, I see assurance that God understands me, that I can, if not understand everything about God, that I have some sort of access to him in a way that is intelligible to me through another human being, rather than, this sort of like overwhelming nebulous concept. I also see a God who I know is on my side, who is not opposed to me, and a God who loves me in ways that can make that God uncomfortable. And I think that's really remarkable. I think there is an assurance of God loving us in a very parental and protective and wonderful way in the incarnation story that I would miss if I were to become a different religion. I think I would miss that, but but like I said, I'm not a Muslim or a Jew, so I'm not gonna put myself in some kind of positive conversation with them because they're not here to talk back. So I'm not going to make that move, but that would be my answer. So.
All right. This question comes from David Kim. It says, for Laura, any thoughts on why the actual event of the resurrection is never described in the Gospels? In other words, there's no mention of Christ coming out of the tomb. Thoughts?
Yeah. I think there's some theologian, I think it's Jensen, who says that the resurrection could not be described, that it transcends a description in some way. I can't remember. John would know it. I don't No. I mean, if I was, um, I think the obvious answer for why nobody saw it is that Jesus died, by all accounts, Jesus, by virtue of being executed, died alone and his body was alone. So there was no one to be with Jesus' body to see a resurrection happen. And I think that the fact that nobody is there, again, I'm not trying to make a claim on its theological verifiability, but I think that one thing we see in that is the extent to which Jesus really was abandoned, and the tremendous loss and sacrifice his death was. So I just think that's an interesting part of it. Like, the reality of it is that if you're executed as a traitor in a really horrifying way and all your friends leave and your body is wrapped up and stuck in a corner and left alone, no one's gonna see it come back because no one's there for it. So yeah, I think that's what I would say. So
Okay.
yeah.
Since we couldn't answer a metal theologian's prior question, I'll allow him or her a second question. It says, "Do you think there's anything to John Dominic Crossan's argument that the authentic Pauline epistles were egalitarian, and that it was later writers who brought in the sexism?"
Yeah, it's about. I mean, it depends what you want to do with Colossians and Ephesians, because there's definitely a movement away from between uh, First Corinthians, for instance, and First Timothy. Those are two documents that take very different stands on the value of marriage, the role of widows, what women owe to men, and vice versa. First Corinthians 7 has a very mutual, egalitarian description of marriage. One thing I do think is a fair question is how sexist First Timothy 2 is, because you can definitely follow the rules there. You can make them really sexist. I think it's a fair question of of whether or not there is something localized in view happening. To be clear, I don't think Paul wrote First Timothy 2, but I think there's a fair question there of whether or not this is something particularly localized that the author is worried about. And I think that might push a little bit one way or another on whether or not it's sexist. I think Craig, what's his gosh darn Keener has a really interesting read on that passage about what Eve is doing in that
Mm-hmm.
story. And he thinks that First Timothy. I think Nick actually talked about this on your show.
He
I'm sure
did.
he did.
He did.
Just refresh your memory. That the emphasis there is on learning. That there's a lack of information Eve had by virtue of coming along second, and analogously, there's a lack of information women in the church have by virtue of being women in the first century. And until they can get caught up, there is a level at which it is dangerous for them to take the reins. I think that's actually a perfectly good explanation of what's happening with the Eve imagery in First Timothy 2. And I also have a hard time saying that is de facto sexist, but definitely by comparison with something like First Corinthians, of course it is. So that would be my
Yeah.
answer. So
Let's do maybe one or two more. It says, whoops, where did I go? Okay. Why is evangelizing and converting non-believers so crucial? Is it the edict of Matthew 28:19 to save people from the Christian hell, even though that's not what Matthew 28:19 says, or to help affirm confidence in Christian beliefs?
I mean, here is
Neither of
people
us,
get
neither of us believe in eternal conscious torment, so the question's
right,
kind of missing the
right,
point. But
yeah. Right. I mean, people get snarky as hell when you bring this up. But I actually think the best reason to be a Christian doesn't have anything to do with the afterlife. I think the best reasons to be a Christian are all because on the assumption that I believe it's good to live in accordance with the truth. That I think it is, if there is a God who loves you and wants a relationship with you, why would you not want to hear about that? The incredible power and meaning and significance and comfort that can give to your life. I think that when Christianity is properly instructed and cultivated in communities, I think there's a tremendous benefit to participating in that. Um, and I mean, just I don't know if proud is the right word, but I honestly think the biggest reason why I am a Christian and why I would want other people to be Christians is, like it's such a cool tradition to be part of. Like we have a long story. We have, and of course, like all peoples, like all movements, it's checkered. But like I love participating in Christian art. I love reading novels by Christians. I love reading Christian poetry. So I think being part of this tradition that has stretched back and provides so much comfort and direction and community, I think that's a great reason to be a Christian, and it's also a great reason to want other people to be Christians. Now, how you do that respectfully, and how you do that without reinscribing colonialist patterns, that's a tough question, and that's more than I can answer in this in this conversation. But that's also obviously worth looking at. But I mean, I can't. We could be here all day if we were going to talk about all the reasons why to be a Christian that don't have anything to do with the afterlife. Like, I think I'd probably be a Christian if there was no afterlife.
Yeah.
Honest,
Well, yeah.
I think probably, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So
Let's see. It
yeah.
says, Laura, do you or other scholars that you know of think that any of the gospel writers drew on Paul's letters as sources for their gospels? Love
Yeah.
you and Ian Mills' New Testament Review podcast.
Killer. We love the New Testament Review
Oh,
podcast
by the
too.
way, the New Testament Review podcast is linked in the description. If you don't know what that is, that's
Oh,
Laura and her co-host Ian, their podcast
yeah,
where they discuss New Testament
that's
scholarship,
great.
and they have a YouTube channel now, and so that's what I have linked in there. But also they're on iTunes and anywhere else you can listen to a podcast. But anyway, so did
Thanks
Paul?
so much for linking that. I really appreciate
Oh
that.
yeah, of
Yeah.
course. So did the gospel authors use Paul at all for a source of their material?
Yeah, I think Mark had Paul. I think there's a very good reason to think that Mark had Paul, or if he didn't have a copy of the letters on his desk, that he came from a church that was founded by Paul and in the Pauline tradition. So I think there's good reason to think that.
What makes you think that?
There's I think the fascination with the Pauline so Paul loves the motif of, the weak and the strong, and, like God's power made perfect in weakness. And this is such a pervasive Markan theme that I think there's some kind of a thematic overlap there. That Mark, more than any other gospel, loves the idea that God is manifest in Jesus' weakness and in Jesus' suffering. And that's something that Paul himself is also really interested in. The other part that I think that suggests that it might be more Pauline is just by comparing it to Matthew. So Matthew is famous as one of the more a very Judaized gospel that Matthew takes Mark and puts in Old Testament citations and puts in respect for Torah, puts in respect for Sabbath. So I think of Matthew's taking this gospel and making it more Peter centered. Peter has more screen time in it, and makes it more Torah observant. What's the other kind of Christianity that was out there that Matthew might have been responding to when he looked at this gospel and tried to make it into something that would be more at home in his own church? That would be Pauline Christianity. So I think there's probably some connection between Mark and Paul there. So,
Yep.
and then by extension, I think it was I'm sure somebody said this before Doug Campbell, but I always associate this quote with Doug Campbell that all of the New Testament is a response to Paul, either seconding Paul or speaking or contradicting and correcting him. I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, very good. Thanks so much to the audience for joining us. That's going to be it for today. But if you want to support Help Me Believe and get access to the bonus segment, 5 More Minutes with Laura Robinson, and as well as 5 More Minutes with all of my guests that I have on, you can follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter of the show for as little as $1 a month. At the $5 level, you can get access to all the bonus segments and good stuff like that. But there's a lot that comes with just donating $1 a month. So I really appreciate all of our patron supporters and the audience members who like and share and subscribe and do all that good stuff. Be sure to do those things as well. Laura, thanks so much for coming back on. I really appreciate it. It's always
Absolutely.
fun to have you on. I appreciate it.
I'm always happy to do it. You know that. So good time.